the need for foster care entry, and if entry did happen, positively expedite outcomes. On the next slide, Chris, you'll see that this research fit into a kind of what we saw empirically, but also it aligned with common sense. If you could hit the next button. And our values. Who among us would want to enter into the very complex, sometimes archaic world of dependency courtrooms without a trained advocate by our side? So the research really resonated with what we knew and what practitioners were saying about the value of lawyers. Looking at all of this, a change was made in December 2018, formalized in January 2019. And you'll see the change on the next slide. This looks very similar to the question I showed you earlier. May a 4E agency claim that same 4E funding for child representation and parent representation? And here you will see that the answer has changed to yes. The Federal Children's Bureau has decided that agencies can draw down this funding to more equitably reimburse all parties in the case for high quality legal advocacy, independent from the child welfare agency. So this is very historic and landmark, and a great opportunity that everyone should be looking at in their community. There are already over a dozen states that have executed state agreements to start drawing this down, either for child representation, parent representation, or both. There are other states where these conversations and negotiations are well underway, and there are others where they haven't begun yet. So my one takeaway for you today is I really hope that whatever part of the system you work on or touch on, you'll go back and ask your court improvement program, ask the stakeholders in your community, what's the status of this and how can we use it to elevate the quality of representation that children and parents are accustomed to receiving. Next slide. Since that initial change, we've gotten some further clarification from the federal government. We now know that tribal representation is also included, and that the federal drawdown does not solely have to go to reimburse the cost of attorney advocacy. It can also fund an entire multidisciplinary legal team, including paralegals, peer partners, social workers, investigators, the whole holistic picture that goes to making an excellent legal advocate. This was further bolstered this past summer when the White House issued an executive order further reiterating this commitment to high quality legal representation to children and families, and specifically calling on the Department of Health and Human Services to issue guidance and do some data tracking around this. So we see a bipartisan commitment to legal advocacy, to elevating the voices of parents and children through legal advocacy as a very effective strategy. I want to, on the next slide, just highlight a small caveat. This could get very wonky and we don't have time for it here today, but I want to point out that when we talk about Title IV-E, 50% reimbursement, initially it may sound like 50% reimbursement. It's important to note that it's reimbursement tied to the state-specific Title IV-E rate, which is generally speaking an assessment of how many youth in care are coming from households with a that is linked to a very outdated 1996 poverty estimation. If anyone would like to talk about this, feel free to contact me after the webinar. I could talk about it all day. It's a big policy reform that needs to happen separately. The main thing you should know here is in order to calculate how much drawdown your state might get, you're going to need to look at a state-specific 4E penetration number. Regardless, most of the states that I've talked to and I'm working with are dealing with the 4E penetration number somewhere between 40 and 60%, although there's others that are higher and others that are lower. So they're really looking at maybe 20 to 30, 35% increase in funding for legal representation. And of course, in today's times when budgeting is always tight, who wouldn't be very excited to use this? The trick is to use it not just to continue the current system, but to use it to elevate quality. The next slide shows some examples of how states are already using this money, whether it is hiring to ensure reasonable caseloads, or promoting those multidisciplinary models of practice that we talked about and you'll hear more about today. Building in assurances of quality, like requiring specific trainings or certifications for attorneys. The point is that the funding should be thoughtfully and deliberately used to ensure good representation, not just more of the same, more of mediocre representation that children and families may be used to. In every state or county, there may be a different strategy that could be responsive to the community's needs. And again, after the webinar, I'd be happy to talk through any of these. Each of them is research-based and evidence-based. So having reasonable caseloads, for example, is not just because attorneys want to have reasonable caseloads. It's because research shows that when attorneys spend the time doing specific activities, client communication, out-of-court negotiations, collateral legal work, those are the activities with impact. So by reducing caseloads, attorneys can focus on focus their time where they can have the most impact. The next slide shows how some states are looking at using this funding to ensure legal advocacy at all stages of the case, or as we often say at this, just back one, as we often say in the field, further upstream. So this can range from, Chris, can you go back one slide? Thank you. Ranging from even before a hotline call in a case, where conventional civil legal aid, like the bread and butter that I think many on this call do every day, housing work, public benefits advocacy, family law, all of that stuff can keep kids out of foster care, even though those attorneys don't always identify as dependency attorneys or as child welfare attorneys. Many places are looking at pre-petition models that can draw down this funding to say, hey, why do we even need the child welfare system involved in the first place if what really needs to happen is an attorney needs to have a conversation with a landlord, or if a lawyer needs to make sure that there's a civil protection order in place so that this child can remain safely at home. Going from there, if CPS has become involved, there's definitely room to look at early counsel from attorneys to see if those hotline investigations can be mitigated and prevent them from morphing into court cases. And then, of course, using this funding for that more traditional dependency representation and even through the appellate process. And on the next slide, you'll see just some general themes and challenges that jurisdictions are grappling with. Continuing to focus on this amid the pandemic and amid other important reforms like the Family First Act. This is where I think the legal community is so pivotal. Agencies have a lot asked of them, and advocates can help agencies prioritize the policies and reforms that most warrant their attention, which we believe this is one. I'll now turn it over to David Kelly from the U.S. Children's Bureau to tell us a little bit more. David?
Thanks, Allison. And thanks everyone who's participating for your interest. I'll keep this really brief. Allison did such an outstanding job laying out the history. I won't repeat that, but I did want to briefly just touch on the why and the what and the how of this this policy change that we were so excited to make. So why did we do this? We did it because we have a system that far too often confuses poverty with neglect. We have a system that too often perpetuates and exacerbates disparity. And we have a system that causes far too often trauma through unnecessary parent-child separation. And we have two overarching goals at the Children's Bureau. The first is to prevent the need for families to ever make contact with the formal child welfare system. And the other is to dramatically improve the experiences that parents, children, and young people have with our system when they absolutely must be involved with us. And we have no question that high quality legal representation is absolutely vital to both of those goals. We also feel that the only way to achieve a more just, equitable, and humane system is to ensure that every parent and every child has high quality legal representation at every stage of child welfare proceedings. And on top of that, we believe incredibly strongly that high quality legal representation is prevention. So now on to the what and the how of it. Allison did touch upon this. We very recently, I've lost track of time, sometime during the pandemic, we released a technical bulletin that is something of a Q&A, but also provides some more detail for those who aren't that accustomed with Title 40 of the Social Security Act and how our funding works. So we wanted to get all the information in one place, so our legal partners in particular would have the information that they needed to enter into conversations and explore options with complete information. So the technical bulletin is up. Thank you, Chris, for doing that. I'd encourage everyone to take a look at it on your own time if you haven't seen it yet. A couple highlights that I want to point out and that I hope are of significance to you. The first is reimbursement is available not just for children and young people that are in foster care and their parents, but for those who have been deemed candidates for care. So that means representation can be reimbursed to help children, young people, and parents before they even enter the system. And that is, we view, critical to preventing unnecessary entry, unnecessary removal, unnecessary trauma. A couple other points that Allison did mention, but I'll reiterate, is that the funding is not only for attorneys, but it's for legal teams or multidisciplinary representation. The research makes clear, and we know from talking to parents and young people that they have better engagement, better experiences, and are more empowered when that attorney is paired with either a social worker or a parent peer partner, investigator, a paralegal, or in the best case scenario, all of the above. And we want to participate in making that possible. Another point that I think warrants additional attention is that, as Allison said, the federal contribution here is usually around 50% in most jurisdictions. So that means that there's still an expense on the state level, and it's something that we refer to as the match. And it's really important to know that there's a wide array of options available for states that want to take this opportunity to come up with those matching funds. And those funds can come from LSC itself, can come from philanthropy, can come from the private sector, and those funds could also be state or local funds. The exclusion is federal funding. You can't use federal funding to match federal funding. Those are the main points I wanted to emphasize with all of you. You'll hear next from some outstanding state and local efforts. They're efforts that we've learned from, efforts that we want to promote and support. So I'll just end with saying thank you. Please share this information with all who may be interested. We appreciate your partnership. We can't change outcomes, experiences, or the system without you.
Okay, so now we're going to hear some insights from the field, from some different programs that are out there, beginning with Barbara Buckley. Barbara, are you on?
I am on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Take it away.
Great. Well, thank you. My name is Barbara Buckley, and I'm the Executive Director of Legal Aid Center of Southern Nevada. We are a non-LSC legal aid organization in Las Vegas, Nevada. So 20 years ago, there was no independent legal representation for children in the entire state of Nevada. Our office received a grant and started a Children's Attorneys Project after consulting with the ABA and NACC on how it should be set up. We slowly grew our project, focusing on quality representation. We secured funding from the legislature through filing fees, recording fees from the county. We added slowly over the year until last session, where we secured funding to represent every child in Clark County. So we now represent about 6,000 children a year. We're 72% of the state and represent about 3,600 kids at any given time, with 26 staff attorneys and 350 pro bono attorneys that we supervise. A similar program exists in Washoe County, that's Reno, which is about 14% of the population, and the rurals have some contracts with legal aid and some do their own thing. When we heard of Title IV-E possibilities for matching, we were thrilled at the recognition that our clients are as important as any other party in the room. I heard David Kelly speak at the NACC conference, where we received the inaugural Best Children's Law Project Award. And again, we just couldn't wait to get started. We reached out directly to our Title IV-E agency. Our state is still kind of small enough where, of course, we know our Title IV-E agency very well from participating in court improvement project and just because they're our partners. So we discussed the opportunity and they immediately recognized the benefit of it and started the process. They made a critically important decision with our support to have the program roll out as stakeholders were ready to apply. We were afraid that if we waited for Parents Council and Children's Council in every part of the state with different kind of priorities, it might slow the process down. So our Title IV-E agency was on board with starting the program and then have it be a rolling one where folks could join as they were ready. We went to the legislature together. The Interim Finance Committee approved the budget account to get the program rolling. The state created an application, which the link is on the slides. We were approved and we're off and running. So our focus, we decided first, let's focus on what we really need the most. At any given time when the program started, we had 165 kids on our waiting list who waited anywhere between 90 and 120 days until an attorney could represent them. It's a small number out of the 6,000 we represent a year or 3,600 at any given point in time. But still, they're getting less quality representation than the kids that have an attorney from day one. So that was our top priority, that we would hire attorneys to prevent there from being any waiting for children. So I'm pleased to say we've already cut that waiting list by 70 kids. We hired 2 new attorneys who have already started, who are terrific, and that waiting list hopefully will soon be gone. Our second priority was to reduce caseloads, which prevent attorneys from achieving better outcomes. Our attorneys, in accordance to our protocols, which is about 55 cases per lawyer, and that includes, it's cases, not kids, we were representing about at 387 more children than was recommended. So our second plan is reduction of caseloads. Our third priority is pre-petition advocacy. We have 2 programs that are looking at pre-petition advocacy right now. One is a minor guardianship program. We started in April, where we're beginning to, our goal is to represent every child in minor guardianship actions. We're up to about 100 children. We started in April, right at the start, of COVID. So it was a lot to adjust to. We have a small DV project where we're looking at domestic violence, looking at protective orders to stop cases from coming into foster care. And then we're going to try to revamp an early representation project we had here. And getting all of the stakeholders funded, we think Parents Council will make a difference in getting that going. So that's our next plan in working with our Title IV agency. Our biggest surprise, our penetration rate. I had vaguely paid attention to it over the years, but boy, nothing makes you pay attention to the penetration rate than when your funding is dependent on it. And our penetration rate is 37%. So I was counting on that 50%. So I was very disappointed. But all that means is investigating why our penetration rate is so low is now on my list of things to look at and to see if we can get reversed in 2021, a new goal. So for us, we're grateful for those of you all who advocated for this opportunity for us nationally. We're already a high quality project in that we have dedicated staff, supervisors, training for every pro bono lawyer and staff attorney every month on a new topic, but we can always do better by our kids. And so reduction of the areas where we're overloaded and exploring ways to keep families out of foster care when what's bringing them in is poverty is our next goal. I am happy to chat with any of you later. My email is on the participant list. I know our Title IV agency is also on the phone. I want to recognize them and give our gratitude to them. And that's the experience in Las Vegas.
Thank you, Barbara. And now we're going to hear from Joanne. Joanne, you are not muted. Are you on?
Oh. Hi, everyone. My name's Joanne Moore, and I'm director of the Washington State Office of Public Defense. And our agency mission is, by statute, is to implement the constitutional right to counsel in Washington State. So how our program started was we started a pilot program for parents representation in actually many years ago. I'm not even going to say what year, but in 2005, that pilot program was expanded by the legislature into, similar to what Barbara was saying, into various counties of the state. Before OPD took over parents representation, the counties paid for it and ran programs that were actually, many of them were very poor quality. And that's how we persuaded the legislature that we needed to have high quality representation for parents. In 3 years ago, we completed our statewide expansion of the parents representation program. And we now represent every indigent parent in the state for dependencies and terminations only. We don't have any pre-petition work. we would love to see pre-petition work and early attention or early representation for civil needs of parents in Washington State. And I will say that we are, Washington State, through another agency, the Office of Civil Legal Aid, has started a more robust children's representation program, which is I have no doubt will be expanding as they can show the results of their program in terms of data. So our program, Parents Representation, actually we need to go back 2 slides on that. Our program for Parents Representation features multidisciplinary representation. We have like 200 attorneys in the state. It's all by independent contractor contracts. And so we are able to get that full statewide coverage for every single parent. We also have social workers on our teams, and they work with the parents' attorneys. And we have a becoming robust parent for parent program, which is actually a separate program, but we work with them a lot. So 2 years ago, in 2019, the Parents Representation Program was having a lot of compensation problems. We had hardly been able to increase the compensation for our parents' attorneys for way too long. And we were losing good attorneys because the pay was too low. And so I so well remember the day that up popped an email saying that the Children's Bureau was extending the 4E opportunity for parents and children's representation. It was like a godsend to me. We were about to go into legislative session at that time. And so we were able to apply right away and keep working at it, keep negotiating with our 4E agency. And we were able to work with the legislature to get language that made it clear that our 2 state agencies had to be working together to realize this opportunity. And then we got a great agreement with the 4E agency, and we were able to collect under that agreement about $5.5 million a year, which enabled us to raise compensation of our attorneys to a good rate. And also we added about 7 new attorneys and 8 social workers. So it's made a huge difference in our ability to give services appropriately. So I want to give a plug, because this is a legal aid audience or group. I want to give a plug for what legal aid can do with for families and children by working on representation upstream. We have seen in Washington, we had a pilot program for civil legal aid representation of families that was in existence for about 3 years, and it was modeled on the Michigan program at University of Michigan for obtaining needed civil legal aid or civil orders for parents, housing problems, etc. And it was a great program. Unfortunately, it was not funded, so it is closed, but I figured that if that's a temporary closure, and this 4E opportunity is going to be very instrumental, I have no doubt, in getting that program going again. So next slide, please. Oh, and I wanted to just note that, Barbara, we have a terrible pen rate also. Ours is 36%, so we can get 18% of our costs reimbursed. But it's still a lot. That 18% really adds up. And so partially what this depends on is that 1996 poverty rate, which is used, which is really, that is just ridiculous. Okay, wanted to tell you about a wonderful resource that's available. This is the Family Justice Initiative, and it is a great organization. I just happen to be one of the executive directors, so I know well how good it is. But this is funded by the Casey family, and it's a combination of children's and parents' representation. The initiative has created, in a very short period of time, gathered together a lot of resources that are really useful, advocacy resources, and best practices information that is so important and pertinent today. Has a wonderful section, and this is the next slide, on federal funding, the 4E program. And I don't know if you can see it because the print is so small, but this includes a number of 4E agreements that have been negotiated in different places with their state departments. And these are, this is a place where you can see different kinds of agreements that have been made. So it's quite useful. So I think that we're, as a movement, we are getting incredible progress now. And we can work together and access all of these opportunities that we have that have been made available by the Children's Bureau. So let's go for it.
So now we're going to hear from Karen Lash, the director of the Justice and Government Project at American University, who's going to talk about some of the other funding sources and opportunities there are out there. Karen, I see you're already off mute. Are you ready to go? Karen? Okay, we're having just a minor difficulty here. I don't think we have Karen's audio. Just bear with us.
Wait, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Karen. Thank you so much.
Oh my God. A nod to that phone commercial. Okay, thank you, Chris, and for helping us with all that technological magic. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to make the point that there are other state administered federal funds that, not unlike Title 4E, that other state agency administrators could use to provide legal services that also help stabilize families and potentially prevent removal or speed kids to permanency. And that perhaps for the 4E administrators dialing in, that, you know, these are opportunities for peers that you might team up with, or for the providers in the crowd for you to reach out to directly. So on the next slide, there are a few fan favorites relevant to the kinds of legal issues that arise in the child welfare context, and each is funding legal services in states all around the country. The first is the Victims of Crime Act Victim Assistance Formula Grant. These can be used, for example, for legal assistance to help with child abuse and neglect or domestic violence. TANF, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is pretty flexible in terms of the kinds of legal help allowable with those funds, and pretty much, most of the legal issues associated with poverty, and they could help families with self-sufficiency. And while the CARES Act authorized many different funding streams, the Coronavirus Relief Fund is by far the largest and most flexible, so long as those expenditures are for a response to the pandemic. And because your state must spend these funds for pandemic-related costs incurred by December 30th, time is running out. But it could be a source for technology needs for providing legal representation remotely to families in the child welfare system. The 4E funds can also be used for that, by the way, but these don't require a match. Now, on the next slide, which is just completely awful, it's just the first page of my project's grants matrix, so you'll know you've found it when you click on that first URL. But the point is that each of those tiny dots indicates a different state-administered federal funding source that allows for legal aid. And it includes, of course, the three on the prior slide, as well as 4E. And so that you can learn more about it. It's got easy to understand, high level information, and with links for you to drill down deeper. There are some additional handouts about VOCA, TANF, and CARES Act funding as well that are all linked in the footer of this slide. And on the next slide is just a couple more resources. It's a shout out to Allison and NAC for their excellent 4E policy update page, and for emphasis, as Joanne mentions, the Family Justice Institute website URL just there for you once again. So I think that leads us to a Q&A. If although I'm not sure our participants knew that they could be entering questions in the chat box.
So I do have one question that came through to me during the presentation that might be for David or maybe anyone on the panel. They're part of a committee that's worked to implement statewide Title IV agreements. They've already been drawing down reimbursement funds, but they've noted that reporting requirements have changed. They're trying to better understand the reporting requirements and the data that needs to be there. And they want to know if they have questions as they continue to meet with the different groups involved. Is there anyone in this group today on this panel or anyone at the federal level that would be the best person to send those questions to? And they said that their questions were not necessarily addressed in the technical bulletin that came out this summer.
Sure, I can take that one. So every federal region, and there are 10, has a regional Children's Bureau office, and there's oftentimes one person assigned to handle every child welfare related kind of issue in the state, or sometimes the work is divided a little bit. But I can share as follow-up the directory so you can know who to call at the regional level to talk through those issues. Part of the reporting, let me back up. The Child Welfare Agency is the entity through which the funding travels, and they are the entity that's required to report. For legal representation, what comes to us is very minimal, and it's essentially a total amount of money spent on or claimed, and that's really most of what we see. But the federal regional office can talk through that with you if you have more specific questions about how to do that reporting and what's necessary.
And not a question, but we did have one attendee note that the FJI, which Joanne had mentioned, is hosting a webinar about pre-removal representation tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And I'm going to send that information that was shared with me to all attendees right now in the chat. So you should now see all of that information in the chat. That should be now shared with everyone. Do you have any other questions at this time? We'll stay on for a bit. Just type them in the chat, or you can contact the attendees or myself at NLADA. I'm going to put my name and email in the chat to everyone. So if you have any questions about this or any other NLADA programming, please do not hesitate to send out an email. If you're not able to contact the panelists directly, or you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at NLADA.
Chris, all of our contact information is on the last slide.
All right, that's right.
One
So
more. There you go.
Sorry. I'd forgotten about that last slide. Thank you, Karen. Okay, so I have another question that just came through. Have any of the panelists actually received money from the 4E program yet? Have funds actually been dispersed?
This is Barbara. We have received all of our documents and forms to draw down our money, including our NOSA. So the cash isn't in our hands, but everything's been approved and the documents to draw down have been issued, and we believe in our state agency and that we already hired. So we'll be looking to get reimbursed and receive the funding shortly.
And this is Joanne, and over the last year, we received $5 million from reimbursements, which we had to have to support the new people we had hired or contracted with.
Yeah,
It worked. It worked.
Washington State is not alone. There's been a growing number of state agency claims. I won't be able to tell you exactly how many, but I think there are upwards of a dozen or more states that have already received reimbursement.
One question to the panel is if you're in a state that's just beginning this and your interest in this process, what should be your first steps in terms of just thinking about starting out with this and getting the ball rolling?
I can maybe start out and turn it over to some of my co-panelists on that, Chris. But one of the first things is to start a conversation with your Title 4E Child Welfare Agency. They are the only agency that can channel this funding. A legal services provider cannot directly go to the federal government and start claiming. So that means that you need a strong collaboration with them, and that they need to first understand the value that may be very readily apparent to them depending on the nature of your court community, or it may take some persuasion, showing them the research to convince them of something that may seem counterintuitive at first. Why would they fund their legal adversaries? And in some places, this feels like strange bedfellows in that first conversation. But once you talk about the research, you talk about the values that David spoke to earlier, the importance of elevating youth and parent voice at every stage, and how this can help them meet their goals that they also have on a performance level. I think that's the first thing that you're going to want to do, is find a good partner in leadership in the Child Welfare Agency, and also perhaps consider bringing in your court improvement program lead. There are other leaders who are well versed in this. Most CIPs have attended some training or convening in the last 2 years where this has been discussed. And they also have a wealth of information and even data about what strategies may be the most effective. Those are two places where I would begin.
Yeah, I would simply reemphasize all that Allison has just said. I think that is the perfect place to begin. It's a necessary beginning in most places. And I would also add to give some thought and intention to what it is that you would like to do with these potential dollars, and how it is that that would benefit the Child Welfare Agency. How is it that this new or enhanced work that you would do with the federal funds will make their job easier, will help them serve families and children better when they need to be served, and help reduce their caseloads by successfully keeping families out of the system that ought not to be there. So yes to everything Allison said, and think about your messaging and marketing.
We had another question about if some of the presenters would be willing to share some of their invoicing document process. Does anyone want to take that one?
Yes, this is Barbara. My email is there, and we're happy to send what we have to anyone who requests it.
Also, just minor issue, I did share a link for that webinar tomorrow, and it looks like, for whatever reason, which I'll say is sloppiness, I did not paste the full link. So if you tried that link, it probably didn't work for you. But I put the correct link. It's now at the bottom of the chat. So I apologize to anyone who tried to go register for that webinar tomorrow, only to get a bad link. It is correct now at the bottom of the chat. I don't see any other questions, but I wanted to ask particularly Joanne and Barbara, although anyone I guess Allison, you could deal with this as well. Thinking about the Title 4E process and where you are now and what you know, what is something that you wish you would have known a year ago that you know now that you might have had to learn the hard way or has been part of the process as you've been navigating some of these issues?
I think for me, it was actually realizing that it can be something of a long process to negotiate and work everything out, especially if no one else in your state has accessed this money. And so just be ready. You need to put enough time in and enough time, as Allison said, to develop the relationship. That's the main thing. Otherwise, it's been very smooth, and it's been invaluable to have this additional funding.
I think for me, as I mentioned earlier, I wish I would have known the penetration rate earlier so that some of my team wouldn't have been a little bit more excited than they ended up being. And then the other thing I didn't realize, or it kind of came after we had already submitted all of our documents and received our NOSA, which was that wonderful clarification about what expenses were eligible for match. In the beginning, we thought it was just attorneys, and then later it was clarified that it could be paralegals as well and staff to support the attorneys, and that was really critical. And that clarification, which was wonderful, I'm not sure if it was question 31 or 32. I actually sent it to our state Title IV agency and said, hey, look, we can claim more, but we had already gotten all of our forms and our NOSA. So that is something I wish I would have known earlier.
Excellent. Well, it is now approaching 2 o'clock. I don't have any other questions in the chat. I want to thank everyone who attended today for coming. I want to thank all of our excellent panelists for really an amazing job and for your patience in dealing with the technical difficulties on our end. You guys have been amazing. This is really valuable information, and thank you for all of the work that you've put in, not just to make these things happen, but to make sure they happen and that other people can learn from them and disseminate that information throughout the field. We really appreciate it. So thank you to everyone, and we'll see you at the next webinar.